Okay, welcome back. I think the panel in the morning identified gaps in our knowledge and raised the type of questions we need to focus on more urgently, which is exactly what panels like these are meant to do. Our next panel, our final panel, explores resilience to information, what stronger independent media can do, and will be moderated by Viktor Makarovs, Special Envoy on Digital Issues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, Vice Chair of the former Council of Europe Committee of Experts on Freedom of Expression and Digital Technologies. Mr. Makarovs, you take over.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this second panel. I think in many ways it will follow up on some of the discussions that we already heard during this conference. I will start by quoting from the one of the drafts, at least, of the key messages from this conference, which I was allowed to do by the organizers. And it says, empowering users through media and information literacy measures is essential for developing resilience to disinformation and countering manipulation of information. Now, I do not expect any of you in this room to disagree with that. So the point is probably not to take a vote on this, but rather go somewhat into more detail and see what the challenge of disinformation actually is today, and also in what ways specifically independent media can help deal with this challenge. To do that, we have 6 speakers today. I will start with from the very end, so to say. We have with us today Melanie Lepultier, who is Council of Europe Congress Rapporteur on Local and Regional Media. And Melanie is also Mayor of Sommervieux, a town in the region of France where they produce Calvados, so very important. We have also with us today Eva Nenadic, who is Research Fellow at the European University Institute, Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom, and also you are at the European Digital Media Observatory. Andrew Moga, who is with us, who I understand had contributed that particular line that I just quoted. Andrew is Chief Executive at the News Media Coalition. We have with us also Adrien Echen, who is Senior Policy Advisor at the Federal Office of Communications in Switzerland, and Adrien is also Chair of the Council of Europe Committee of Experts on the Integrity of Online Information. Elmar Svetis is head of the Riga office of the RFRL, and some of you may not know what RFRL is, so I'll spell it out: Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, but Elmar will tell you more about what that organization does. And before we hear from these panelists, we also have with us for a keynote speech Jānis Sārts, who is Director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence. And Jānis, we asked you when constructing this panel, designing this panel, to give us a brief overview of the landscape. What does it mean, disinformation, what does it mean? What are the risks? What is resilience to disinformation, and what do you think media can do to deal with that?
Well, thank you very much, and hello everyone who has the resilience to be staying here for the last panel of this conference. So you have at least one feature required to fight disinformation, and that is resilience. So to discuss what I've been asked to kind of paint the picture, I think first and foremost, it's really important to understand the overall context. First and foremost, to me, for context, it's important to understand that information space nowadays is a space of conflict. I might assume that for many of you, that's not the first idea that occurs when you look and think about the information space. But I will submit to you that there are quite a number of actors, namely Russia, China, and a few others, that actually both think about it this way, but also act in our own information space with this as a primary assumption. Are they the only actors in the information space that drive disinformation and influence campaigns? Of course not. There are many more actors, non-state actors, other state actors, sometimes the neighboring countries' actors that are putting these kinds of things into our own information environment. But I think the key premise for me, very, very important, is to recognize it's not amorph, it's not abstract. There are, in our information environment as we speak, people that wish harm to our societies, to our democracies, and actually are pursuing different strategies in the same information environment to reach that goal. Second, digitalization of the information environment. The importance of that cannot be overstated. In the good old days, in the information environment, media, traditional media, were in a driving seat. So they were, in a way, defining what's being discussed, what's actual, what's the debate about, and the pluralism and ethics and standards of that media also created and shaped the way information was flowing. This is no more. Media is in a back seat as one of the passengers trying to have the ride with the rest of the digital inhabitants of this space. And the logic, which as I've referred was very important to the quality discourse in a democracy, has disappeared. It's attention economy these days. It's about algorithmic triggering. It's about ability to reach audiences. And I know that many of you know these circumstances where individual influencers have a reach far greater than some of the supposedly influential high-quality media. That's the reality of this environment. Third qualification of this is because, largely linked to the second, is that the logic of media market is disappearing. Not everywhere it's fully understood, but from the smaller markets like Latvia, where I would argue private media logic almost has disappeared, how to earn money as a business model, I think increasingly is getting everywhere. In this country, from the ad revenue that was typical way of creating a media market, 80% plus goes to Google and Meta, just two of the digital players. I think in the future it will be even more so. So actually the money to fight the disinformation is increasingly scarce, at least from a media perspective. On top of that, the big change is coming. We kind of thought that's all already changed, but the change that is coming is far more substantive, and that's incoming of the AI, generative AI. I think we've started to see bits and pieces of what it can do, like deep fakes that are democratic, easy to make, and extremely believable. At this point in time, the capability to generate anyone's voice in this panel with high accuracy and believability without actually ability to detect, is it generated or is it authentic, is already here. So how would one, in election circumstances, deal with that reality? Not to mention that generative AI is fastly growing, and the the companies that are now developing these AI models believe that in 5 years, 90% of the internet content would be generated by AI. But think of it, 90% of what is where we consume information, where we take away what is the reality, is not going to be produced by humans, but by AI. So these are the kind of context situations that makes so much easier to put disinformation rather than fight it. But I think there are some quite important elements. First, the weight and the importance of journalism in this circumstance just grown. The trouble, of course, is, do we still have a credibility in societies into the journalists? We want to have it, at least someone that we have a beacon of orientation in an information environment. But frankly, I would say there are very few societies, at least in Europe, that I know of where it is still pretty much the case. In most other cases, it's starting to get affected. Second, journalist has to adapt. It has to adjust to the realities. So how do you keep up with all of this disinformation avalanche if you're like doing the investigation analysis in the way it was done 10 years ago? It is inconceivable you'll be able to keep up with the pace. So adjust, adapt, and use the same tools. Start using AI tools. Find a way how you can use AI for your own advantage. And the last piece, discussion with technology companies. We cannot deal with a problem of disinformation as it is right now without the discussion. And I'm increasingly more and more convinced that it's not anymore as much of a discussion with social media companies. We've tried for years, and we have a lot of data that they're really still neglected. But increasingly, we have to have that discussion with the companies that develop new generative AI tools. That is, I think, the shift that has happened. So there'll be many actors in current and tomorrow's information environment that will see that disinformation and influence campaigns is a very good tool to create chaos, to harm democratic nations and advance their interests. First, there'll be big pressures on equality of the information environment, and there'll be increasingly less ability of a human and a human brain to distinguish what is what in that information environment. And thus my point is, journalism is going to be really important, but under a lot of pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis, for this very cheery and positive take on where we are now. We will come back to the actionable points, what has to be done in the next round. But let's start with the key point. And I do hope you will push back a little bit on Yanis' idea of you being backseat passengers who are losing money and are increasingly replaced by AI. Let's look at the key question here. What can media do? And I know two things will sort of I'll get pushback from you on two aspects. First, you represent very different parts of media, very different missions. And second, of course, weak media cannot really help. So it's always a circular question about the resilience of media as well. So I suspect you will inevitably say that you also need an enabling environment for the ecosystem, and I expect also to hear more about the platforms and so on and so on. But let's try to still approach this as a circular issue, not only focusing on what the media need. I would like to start with Elmas. Now, you work in a particularly, shall we say, hellish environment, I suspect. But you know better, tell us.
I mean, we all do, don't we? And I think Janis already touched upon a couple of things that I think some of my co-panelists will be also speaking about: AI, social media platforms. At the same time, when this is a panel about disinformation, but the question is, what stronger media, independent media, can do, and I could even sort of go into what it could do, because this is maybe one of the questions that we, as a conference, may want to ponder. And indeed, where I could sort of maybe chip into this conversation is to talk about Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is a particular media and that is working in a particularly challenging region. So first, it is publicly funded media. It is funded through U.S. Congress, which implies that it's bipartisan funding, so it's not State Department funding. That's one thing. Second, there's a very strong firewall in terms of the content creation. The funding goes through a number of agencies that each dilute the influence of politicians on editorial standards. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty works in 23 countries. The broadcast region is 23 countries, and that includes what was known as CIS. I don't know whether that still exists. Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and a couple of countries in Central Europe and Balkans. So Iran, Russia, Belarus, Caucasus, Central Asia. This is our remit. So it's not an easy thing. The organization is about 70 years old, so there is some experience in actually working on providing independent content to what was then behind sort of Iron Curtain. Now some say behind Iron Bubble. So that's a little bit about Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and I represent an office here in Riga, and this is a newly created office, largely as a result of Kremlin cracking down on our office in Moscow. Now, but coming back to the question, what sort of resilience to disinformation and what can stronger media do? I can speak a little bit about what we are doing in this region, and then we can go into what can be done or should be done. So, I mean, first thing that I wanted to sort of already unpackage is the different types of media. So there's public service broadcasters, there are publicly funded media. BBC is here, Deutsche Welle is here, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty are here now in Riga. So they are in a different category. There's private media, also from Russia, Novaya Gazeta Europa, Meduza, people mentioned, a number of local media outlets. But we will also speak about social media platforms and how are they enabling this. So there are different types of media. That's the first thing. Now, in terms of Russian-speaking audiences, which is largely in significant part of our region, I want to mention two things. One is the content, independent, factual content. One is the approach of the media themselves in terms of what they do, in terms of editorial standards, how to create an interesting content. And another point is actually how to deliver that content, make it available to societies where internet, freedom media is actually being curtailed. And I think these are, sort of, I'm outlining a couple of challenges there that we may want to talk about. And in terms of the content, I think the question, what stronger independent media can do also sometimes is a question to media themselves. Because as Jānis also mentioned, some of it is created maybe through artificial intelligence. Some of it is actually purposefully misleading. So there are state actors, there may be even private media actors who are peddling disinformation. So I think there is a role on the media, responsibility on media themselves to think actually in what business are they? So I think that's one thing, and I think for us, there is this mission that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has, which is sometimes not an easy proposition, but I think I wanted to quote that. RFERL's mission is to promote democratic values by providing accurate, uncensored news and open debate in countries where free press is threatened and disinformation is pervasive. RFERL reports the facts undaunted by pressure. So it is also about the mission statement of a media. So what are we? What do we stand for? Democratic values. And this is not something that media normally, it's implied, but they either stand for independent news, content, maybe profit. And this is something that I think is also important to note. So, so we stand for creating independent news and providing this to 23 countries where the information is actually curtailed. So, first point is the content, and how do we ensure editorially independent, factual reporting in countries where to audiences where this is important. Second, how do we get there? And I think this is also where we have developed a number of digital tools, because I think we see that our audience now is in digital space largely. The radio word in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is somewhat misleading. It started as radio, and we still have radio. In Afghanistan, we had a major radio operation. We still try to broadcast into Russia, but it's reaching parts of what is still called Leningrad Oblast. But largely, our audience is in smartphones or in digital devices. So inbuilt VPNs, ways for our audience to get to information safely, because in Belarus and in Russia, you actually are liable for looking at some of our content. So these, and all of this actually requires money. And now the question is, what can independent media do, or what it should do, and what do stakeholders should do? I think the money issue is also important. I will stop here just to sort of outline a couple of things and have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Elmars, and I would thank you in particular for introducing this distinction between can and could, because can is obviously about what already is taking place, what is being done, and could is about the potential, and I think it's something that we really need to reflect on. Now, Andrin, you, I understand, look at this question more from the perspective of the state authorities in charge of ensuring that media operates appropriately. Perhaps you could also explain a little bit what your organization does, but you also do work within the Council of Europe on integrity of online information. And again, maybe it's something that you want to spell out a little bit to explain what it means, but also referring to the main question.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, today I speak mainly as the chair of the expert committee on the resilience of online information. And I think Jānis set it out beautifully. We often, and individuals actually often navigate a very complex media environment nowadays that goes beyond just the traditional media use. And accordingly, also when we address the challenges, we need to think about what is going beyond just traditional media and what traditional media have to do. And our expert committee has identified 3 specific actors that are really important in this kind of work, namely fact-checkers, that we haven't talked about that much so far in this conference, online platforms, and then users themselves. And first, fact-checkers play a really pivotal role because the practice of fact-checking with clearly defined norms, routines, and behaviors to verify information has already become and will increasingly become central to the modern information landscape. Of course, fact-checkers have been part of newsrooms for quite some time, verifying the information and work that journalists are doing and preventing the publication of inaccurate work. But in recent years, we have seen that a new generation of fact-checkers is emerging that actually are doing much more ex post verification of information that is already public in or present in the public domain. And what we have heard yesterday, actually, when Inga was talking, is that fact-checkers often face very similar challenges to journalists. Of course, they are not always like journalists, but the challenges are similar. And in addition to the challenges with regard to threats, dangers, etc., the information sources, as Yanis had set out as well, have considerably evolved. We're now talking not just about social media posts, we talk about very difficult verifications that you have to do on generative AI. We talk about large data sets that you have to be able to handle. The generative AI element will, of course, make this much more difficult going forward. So advancing fact-checking organization is really crucial. They are a critical tool to enhance trust in news and public communication. They serve as guardians of the information integrity, both before and also after the dissemination of content. And that is really, they can operate within and outside of the newsrooms. And occupying this dual space really allows fact-checking organizations to provide a valuable alternative to just traditional journalism. And the second type, we've already talked about this in this conference at some point as well. Jody especially made the highlight in the previous panel, of course, are online platforms. A key challenge, we have heard it before, is the lack of transparency that we have there, the lack of accountability and explainability of platforms' algorithmic systems, and how they affect the dissemination of this information. And Eliška has really outlined it very beautifully in the last panel. This lack of transparency in content moderation and algorithmic systems and the lack to access of data prevents research and independent scrutiny, and this in turn undermines trust on how we receive and how we consume the information through online platforms. So it is really essential that platforms promote design solutions that addresses these challenges rather than providing or having to make decisions on the content itself, setting in place systemic processes that can look at these elements. And the third type of relevant actors are, of course, users themselves. During much of our discussion so far, we have focused on ways of how we enhance the circulation of high-quality content, for example, through diverse and independent media ecosystems. Or failing this, we try to limit the diffusion of low-quality content through fact-checking, with debunking, through platform design solutions, with limiting the reduce the reach of dis and misinformation. But users will always be exposed to some kind of misinformation and low-quality information. So it is crucial that we equip them to meet this challenge. And one key focus needs to be how users can be empowered to avoid falling in the trap of low-quality content and protecting and alerting others who may do so. So the point that I'm trying to make here is independent media certainly have a pivotal role to play, but we need to look beyond just the independent media at other actors that have to play a significant role in addressing this challenge. Also the limitations that they might have in this space, because of course they will not be able to deal with all of these challenges themselves. And just as a plug, our committee of experts have elaborated the guidance note, which will be published later this year, with certain recommendations, elements that go into more details, more onto the specific things that we can do, but maybe we can talk about this a bit more in the second round.
Thank you, Andrin. But just to follow up a little bit on what you said about fact-checking, the capacity of the fact-checking teams in the media to react to, well, the new technological change, which Yanis said is not coming tomorrow, it's here today. Very quick question. Are the media organizations, by and large, in our region today well equipped to deal with the new technological landscape? You mentioned algorithms by the platforms. Yanis is now saying, no, that's yesterday. We need to go talk to the AI tech. Are media organizations able to deal with that today?
I mean, one question is, are they equipped to deal with it? And probably the answer is partly because generative AI can also be a tool to combat disinformation, to help in fact-checking. So it really depends how these tools are being used. I think the crucial point is that there needs to be vigilance on these new developments and how we can adopt it and include it in our processes of making the media ecosystem more resilient. But I think the second point about traditional media systems and the fact-checking element that you were just referring to, we see a tendency in traditional media where we see journalists that have to do the whole news process from production up to publication. And an element of fact-checking that used to be a specific and a highly specialized element within traditional newsrooms has now become part of this generalist approach. And that puts a lot of stress on journalists to be able to fulfill this, this crucial task in the way that they should and need to do it.
Thank you, Andrew. And this is, I think, a perfect segue into the news media. Andrew, I understand that you represent the specific part of media that is about reporting news, helping people understand what goes on. So, in a sense, of enlightening the public is not something new. It's not just about disinformation. But in this particular environment, what does it mean? What should we expect from the news media in terms of dealing with disinformation? And also, what are the input that the news media needs for that?
Thank you very much. First of all, can I convey a slightly different tone? Because I think there's much optimism to draw upon within the media sector, particularly the news media subset that I represent. So that's traditional, if that is now still the accepted phrase. The traditional news publishers, news agencies, whether they be national or international, some of which include Agence France Presse, that has the biggest fact-checking enterprise and operation of any mainstream media, and is a beacon of hope, certainly in that regard, because it takes fact-checking very seriously. It's also part of its commercial imperatives, so that it remains a viable operation, and that feeds back into journalistic investment as well. So I'm optimistic. You asked the question, are we tooled up to deal with some of these challenges now? Well, if we're talking about 11:30 in Riga, yes. 12:30, I'm not so sure about, because things are moving so fast. But in the context of generative AI and challenges, I can say that management floors, boardrooms are very much aware of the challenges, not only to their own businesses, but also to the role that they play in society. I've never seen so much cohesion, so much accelerated thought, concern, but practical ideas coming out across the media. And by that I mean rights-holding TV, non-rights-holding TV, public sector, private enterprise, collaborating with think tanks, governments. There's a round table on generative AI in the journalistic sphere and the information sphere every day, and that's good. So we're in a really good position to do what we failed to do with the platforms first time round. We believed what they told us. They said that we were going to share in the spoils, that all consumers were going to be pointed to the background news platform that was generating the content, and there was at least going to be a fair opportunity to derive financial benefit from that. And of course that turned out not to be the case. And every day there's another announcement that actually the algorithms have been twisted, so we've got even less We've got small change instead of proper investment potential. So I think we're in a good place. As you know, I represent a subset of the media, so the news media sector. But within that, I think there is a discipline that also needs to be called out. And you alluded to the potential conclusions from earlier on. But I'm going to also read another proposition which supplements that, which is the ability of professional journalists, including reporters, news photographers, and video journalists, to witness events of public interest and to provide objective accounts. These must be safeguarded from control and censorship, including self-censorship. This provides opportunities for social change, creates communities of shared interest, and informs citizens, including the young, as alluded to yesterday within a couple of sessions, about real-world events. Now, if we can all get behind that as a philosophy, we've got a chance of really dynamically attacking the disinformation harm that is going on in society. But we need journalists, reporters and video journalists, to be there on the ground, to act as the eyes and ears of the public that are sitting there at their breakfast tables and in their armchairs, to be able to convey what's going on in the world, to make sense of the world. And that is the essence of journalism. And the reason I'm optimistic, notwithstanding the restrictions on attending events of public interest in the first place, and perhaps you'll give me some time later to speak to that, I'm confident that the integral, nascent yearning to inform and to see and share is always going to be there, and we shouldn't forget about it. So I'm optimistic that we're now talking about the right things. I'm optimistic that outside of this room, public policy makers, the media themselves, will strike out to address disinformation, but also to remain viable and relevant.
Thank you very much, and Andrew. Especially, I appreciate the two key words you mentioned: cohesion and accelerated thought. Sounds wonderful. If only we could have that always across the board when dealing with challenges. We now go to Eva Nenadic. Now, Eva, you are researching at the European University Institute, and your focus is on media pluralism and media freedom. And to me, it sounds like an obvious question to ask, is media pluralism really necessary to deal with disinformation, or do we just live with the fact that there is less funding for media, so it will be streamlined, and those who survive will serve the audiences? Now, it may not be the focus of what you have to say, but I would like to hear from you on that particular account.
Thank you for this question. I think the answer is quite obvious. I'm really glad to be part of this important conversation that comes at a very challenging time, and especially challenging for media, but even more challenging for journalism. And I see a slight distinction there in particular contexts, especially. So many things have been said, and many complex issues have been raised. So I will try to echo some of the points that I find very important and add on additional ones. So what I've been doing over the past decade is working on the issues or studying the conditions for media pluralism and media freedom across the European Union, but also member states. So I'm working with the Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at the European University Institute, where we run the Media Pluralism Monitor, which is a project that also serves, so basically the Media Pluralism Monitor looks at the conditions, but in particular risks to media pluralism and media freedom, as I said, in all EU countries and in member states across 4 dimensions. One is the fundamental right, then there is the political independence, market conditions for media, but also social inclusiveness dimension, so access to media to different vulnerable groups in society in particular. So this is one aspect of the story, and an important aspect perhaps to mention is that the results of the monitor have also been used over the past years to inform the media pillars of the rule of law reports that the European Commission is issuing. And then the other project that I've been working on over the past several years is called the European Digital Media Observatory, where we in particular coordinate the work on studying, researching, and assessing policies against disinformation. So of course, in order to deal with policies, we also need to comprehend and understand deeply different dimensions and facets of this complex problem of disinformation. So with these two streams somehow of my work, I come to my first point, which is, and I wasn't planning to speak about this, but hearing what other speakers said, I really want to emphasize that it's a really difficult moment for media and for journalism, because they need to battle. They need to fight battle in two serious and very dangerous for our democracy battlefields somehow. So the first one is that what we are seeing for the Media Pluralism Monitor is the fact that media organizations, but journalists in particular, are still struggling across the EU with very traditional risks to media pluralism and media freedom. In particular, political independence is something that I would like to mention here. And then at the same time, they need to fight for sustainability and relevance in the online environment against very serious and way more powerful opponents, which are the digital platforms. So this is one side of the story. And then looking at the other side of the story, which is this specific issue that we're focusing on in this panel, and it's the challenge of disinformation, which European Commission has recognized as one of the major challenges for European democracies and their sustainability long-term is the problem of disinformation, of course. And then we are seeing a lot of attempts and policy measures that are trying to tackle or address, answer to this problem of disinformation. They are also trying to somehow establish basically more balance between the key players in this field. And I think we see that there should be perhaps more consideration about the relationship between the different actors here. And perhaps we could also focus a bit more on the very complex interplay between the media and platforms, but also media and fact-checking organizations. So as we know, over the past several years, the number of fact-checking organizations globally has doubled, but they are increasingly establishing themselves separately from the media, and they are diverging, which is perhaps not the trend that we would like to see. We would like to see more collaboration and cooperation there, because this is what is in the public interest. And then going back to the topic, to the title of the panel, which is, or the question, what stronger independent media can do, I would just like to chip in with two additional points for this first intervention, and this is, it has been said already, but I would like to echo it a bit, and it's the kind of dual and conflicting role that the media play in this environment with regards to disinformation. So at one point, or they can be both part of the problem and solution to this. So due to decline in professionalism, clickbait strategies, attempts to provide for financial sustainability, perhaps on the cost of professional standards, very often we are seeing media on the side where we don't want to see them, and this is the side contributing to the problem of disinformation, because what we know from research is that way more people learn about disinformation narratives from mainstream media than they do from social media. So with the same logic, mainstream media, or especially public service media, could and should play the role, if they are sustainable, independent, and trusted, they are definitely best positioned to break, dismantle, and debunk some of these information narratives, and then provide accurate and complete disinformation or counterbalance disinformation in this context. So this is the dual role that we don't tend to mention very frequently, and I think it also should be reflected even more in policies tackling disinformation, where sometimes we don't see media sitting at the table with digital platforms, with fact-checking organizations, and similar, where certain measures are adopted to fight disinformation. And just a key word from the title about independence and stronger and quality, which is also very important, and I would like to add there. So stronger independent media are indeed the most important counterbalance to disinformation, but As we know, many things are called media today. It has become very difficult to define media, especially in this challenging information environment. And I want to somehow repeat what I already said, is that media organizations and journalism are not always synonyms. They are not always, unfortunately, on the same sides, and sometimes editorial autonomy is particularly challenged by the media management or media owners in some countries. So this is something to keep in mind. And when speaking about independence, we know very well from the Media Pluralism Monitor that countries, or there are still various mechanisms of political control over media, especially in certain regions of Europe, exercised through, for example, appointment procedures in public service media, through politicization over ownership of the media, but also more indirect means, such as the distribution of state advertising and so on. But then I think very important aspect that has been mentioned already, and I'm sure that we will discuss it even further, is this dependence of media on online platforms. Because what we are seeing there, I mean, this is the changing information environment, which we cannot deny. We didn't mention enough, I think, over the course of 2 days, the changing habits of audiences, especially of youth that are departing from media. They are exercising or showing higher rates of news avoidance. For them, news sources are influential individuals online, and this is something that we need to keep in mind when thinking about the role of media and what media is today or what it should be. So this growing dependence on online platforms is something that should definitely be considered, especially their power of distribution and audience reach, especially because of this, because they are serving as primary gateways to news to many people nowadays. And unlike in the traditional media systems where news was an integral part of the news outlet, this is no longer the case in the digital environment. So news is increasingly being, what we say, it lives a life of its own, because it travels in this online sphere based on algorithmic recommendations, based on personal recommendations, and editorial line or editors somehow lost the control over their content, and it's the platforms who actually have the control over their content. So I think in thinking of the information environment and re-establishing balance between the key actors in this sphere, this is something definitely to keep in mind. And I'm super happy to speak about the importance of self-regulation and co-regulation in this area and some measures that are being taken, but perhaps I'll leave this for the second round. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Honestly, lots of questions here. And one thing I've noticed is that the word platforms keeps popping up as you speak. And then one of my questions would be, okay, platforms in control now. And Yanis tells us that even that is not going to be the case. Someone else is. But I have one question, perhaps, and it can be a huge discussion, Eva, but more from the point of view of terminology from the academic side of it. If a media organization consistently engages is misinforming people, creating false impressions, pushing narratives that are counterfactual, is it still a media, or shall we call it a propaganda outlet or something else? Or do we say, okay, that's also a kind of media, different from what Andrew's group is doing, but also a subset of the media industry?
I think, you know, in the case that you just described, it could be easy to label this as propaganda and not media and just change terminology. But what the challenge is that we have a lot of outlets that are dancing on the both sides. So at the same time, they provide a lot of clickbait sensationalism that is feeding into misinformation, disinformation narratives. On the other side, they are at the same time providing a lot of quality journalism. So in many countries, we are seeing outlets, media organizations that are providing both. So how do we deal with this? How do we strengthen this quality side and try to ponder somehow this, the problematic side of the medium? Of course, the clickbait is related or is there to feed the struggle for sustainability.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Now, Melanie, you, I understand, see this issue of disinformation and media from the perspective that most people actually feel is the most important in their daily life. It's about the town, city where they live. Your concern, I understand, is with the local media and what their role is and what their problems are. And I understand that you have a lot of research and insights to share about that.
Yes, good morning. Indeed, since yesterday we've been all wondering about how to combat misinformation, but just imagine there were simply no media anymore. No information about decision taken, no scrutiny of decision makers, no fact-checking. This is a reality we faced when we prepared this report, the October session report on local and regional media as watchdogs of democracy and guardians of community cohesion. We tackled this very special angle of local and regional media. In the UK, for instance, more than 320 journals disappeared between 2009 and 2019. In Portugal, this number dropped from 700 to 400. And in France, more than 100 local agencies closed during the same period, which was the pre-COVID period. It was even worse afterwards. And my own village in Calvados, Normandy, a very special place to visit beyond or with the drink beside. But in my own village, Somerville, we don't have any newspaper, and we barely receive a few lines in the regional newspaper once or twice a year, I would say. It was said earlier, many traditional local media always struggle with the digital era today. Few people are now willing to pay for online news, but even more for local online news. And the ad revenues have gone down with the rise of online platforms. The consequence is that quality of local media declines. There are no more funds to pay competitive or even simply to pay salaries. Besides economic reasons, the working conditions of local journalists also play a role, especially when it comes to their safety and independence. The Council of Europe platform for the safety of journalists has seen an increase in alerts of violence, including local journalists. This is why the Congress also supports this campaign on the safety of journalists that was launched yesterday. And local journalists have a very special and particular place. They are in a very particular position. They are literally much closer to the politicians or the people they should hold accountable. They simply go to the same doctor, the same supermarket, their kids go to the same schools. And because of this proximity, we can see that some people are losing trust into the journalists. They know sometimes, and sometimes consider them as standing in the pay of the local politicians. This was particularly the case in France during the Yellow Jacket crisis. And thus, journalists become more vulnerable to the pressure from the politicians, but also to the pressure from the audience as well. This is particularly worrying because if local democracies are the cornerstone of democratic societies, local media should be the foundation of a healthy, pluralistic media landscape. And this is why we, the Congress of the Council of Europe, because we are a political assembly of mayors, local councillors, and regional parliamentarians, work to strengthen local democracy. So why are local media crucial to combat disinformation? That's the question. And what we as local authorities can do. Local media have a political role as watchdog of democracy. They report on events on a much precise scale than national media, of course. They hold local authorities accountable for the local decisions, daily life decisions impacting citizens' lives, such as infrastructure, parks, leisure, garbage collection, schooling, health. But they also have a social role. They are primary sources of information for communities. They make citizens feel listened to, which is very important, and helps to strengthen the sense of community. And I would say that they are often the last consideration for the less visible people. And we saw in the last few years that they are also fundamental in crisis situations. That was the case, of course, during the pandemic, but also during natural crisis. They are here to inform citizens and help the communities and the local authorities. So what if local media disappear? Well, without trustworthy local news, social media become the primary sources of information for many communities. We could say, and we have a phrase in France saying that there are 60 million of experts and probably 60 million of journalists as well sometimes. But with this kind of sources, this leaves people at best with information of hazardous quality or at worst susceptible to the spread of misinformation. But it also means that local authorities have a monopoly on what is communicated. It opens the door to partial information, disinformation, or even propaganda. But this is also a matter of equality, because we can see that disadvantaged or most rural communities, and I'm elected in a rural part of Normandy, are particularly at risk of becoming local news deserts and have often a lower level of news literacy to shield them from this or misinformation. So really, I think that the key step to make communities more resilient to disinformation is ensuring the existence and the sustainability, quality of local and regional media. That's very important.
Thank you very much, Melanie. I think a great illustration of how there is a huge gap between the importance of local media and the actual situation and level of support. I have a quick follow-up question. We cannot go into the detail on this, but how often do you see this issue addressed by public, perhaps state subsidies and funding, perhaps special grants for local media in the countries that you look at? Is it something that exists at all?
Yeah, yes, I think because that's the case that we said a few minutes earlier. It's really difficult to have some data about this, about local news deserts and what we can do about it. But I think I should be optimistic as well and say that, yeah, in some countries you have some funds either from the governments or the regional governments as well, or from the media association. It works even more if both are working together to either, without coming on very practical things, but to train journalists or to guarantee the sustainability of local media. But you have also, and we have examples in France of media that or audiences or stakeholders that choose to invest in media. This is the Solidarity Press companies. You have one of the most sold newspaper in France, West France, which is in this case, and they are here ready to ensure that what is published is serve the community, and they do help their community in their projects. And that's this newspaper, I think, has less difficulties than others today.
Thank you. Now, I think we are ready to move to the next stage of the discussion, and we need to make it much shorter. On the actionable points, let's do it like this. Because most of the people in the room, I suspect, are from the media industry, obviously you might have a recommendation and actionable points that the media industry can actually take up and do something, but you also might have something to say to policymakers. We don't have platforms with us, but the policymakers should be watching this and also reading the conclusions. So what is your request to them? So 2 actionable points, one to yourselves as the media industry, another one to policymakers. Yanis, would you mind?
I'm not quite the media industry, obviously. I think my first and clear-cut actionable point would be clear-eyed. I'm in this role for about 8 years. I've heard this discussion about platform interaction and all of that, and it's still in the same place. And I think we have to recognize where are the limits, what is the trajectory, and where we're going. So my proposal is like that journalism is going to be required, the core element, and that is quality outline of the reality by a professional that is unbiased as possible and independent, given to the society. That's what will be necessary. But if we stick to the traditional, and Elon Musk calls them legacy media, by the way, traditional form, we might be doomed. That will, in my view, will not survive. If we are able, with the understanding of the core principle, adjust, then there is a future. Second, to me, is go and use the technology that is transforming everything. Because I think there is an opportunity in generative AI in a way that it is taking out, from a media perspective, some of the power out of the social media platforms into more like everyone who can use it or is capable of being skilled user of this new technology. And if I have one plea to all the journalists in the room, go get and be able to use it as a tool to your own goals and to your own mission. And that is, I think, what I would have as a two-piece.
Thank you. So to the media industry, firstly, the news media industry in particular, remain faithful to the principles of our great profession, but at the same time to adapt to the future consumption needs of the young in particular, to stand up for what is right in terms of our place in society, and to be much more collaborative one to another to ensure that issues of existence and fringe aspects of what we do are resolved. And within that, I would say the most important thing is for us to be smart around technology and to identify ways of easy transition by us all, including the young, to drill through their smartphones into authoritative, authentic, witness-based journalism. If they lose the will to live after 3 seconds, we've lost the engagement with our consumers and with our fellow citizens. So that's probably quite a bundle for me to go back with. And then to public policymakers, I think there is a failure to understand the real challenges on the ground of journalism, and by that I mean, if I can just momentarily take you outside of this room and let's think about whether journalists are free to get into press conferences at political rallies, whether they have to pay to attend a political rally, as happens in the UK, whether they can ask difficult questions of stars and athletes and celebrities. Can they control their own copyright content, or have they got to give away the control over that material? These are burning questions for our industry, and I want public policymakers to be much more critically aware of that challenge because it undermines everything.
Yeah, so again, because we spoke about duality, so there is maybe a question to media and then to policy makers. And I am not here to sort of tell other media what to do, but I can tell what we are doing in terms of that, that media industry role. And I think one premise is that, yes, the content is the king, so you have to be able to make an interesting content that is interesting to your audience, but that is also editorially checked and verified, so high editorial standards. I have, we have Ukrainian language service, we have Russian language service, we have Armenian language service, we have Azeri language service. So how do you report from those people on the war in Ukraine, on situation in South Caucasus, that it withstands the scrutiny of both sides, and that you can actually stand up to your reporting. And obviously, another distinction that I wanted to chip in is about this plurality, but we need to distinguish facts and opinion. So I think there is a limitation on what you can peddle as disinformation on facts, but there is value in opinion, in plurality of opinion. So I think this is another thing. So on policymakers, so for policymakers, again, I'm on thin ice here, but I was thinking about my children as I was coming to this conference, and I would want them actually to be living in a sort of medium term in an environment where there is plurality of thinking, where there is an enabling environment of consuming news and opinions in different languages. They may be consuming news in English, in Latvian, maybe in Russian, about things that are happening in their world, wherever it may be. So I think it's that enabling environment and value of actually having plurality, and sometimes that actually costs money. So that's one thing that I wanted maybe to chip in, and I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Elmar, for bringing the money into the conversation. So maybe we'll talk about that even more later. But Eva, your 2 points.
So on the level of journalism, what I strongly believe we need is more efficient self-regulation. We tremendously and urgently need this to promote and encourage quality in journalism. And this can only be done by journalists themselves. At the level of media organizations, I think we should insist more with all the adequate and available tools for them to ensure accurate and ethical independent reporting supported by quality training. So we haven't really had a chance to speak much about investments in training for journalists, especially considering how the environment changes, evolves with new technologies and everything. And of course, adequate working conditions for journalists. Again, perhaps money issue, but it's very important. At the level of states, you mentioned the enabling environment. I mean, this is a clear commitment. There should be an enabling environment for freedom of expression. There should be clear protection of media pluralism and so on. So this is very clear. We already have standards here. We already have international, intergovernmental agreements on this, but we should see perhaps more on the implementation side. At the level of policy, especially policies related to disinformation, I would like to emphasize one point. So within the European Union, we have one instrument that is being exported also globally, which is called the Code of Practice on Disinformation. And this Code of Practice on Disinformation was first conceived in 2018, and then, because of some shortcomings in the first iteration of the instrument, of this kind of self-regulation, voluntary self-regulation by major online platforms with advertisers in the first format, it was strengthened, and this new version was released last summer with some key performance indicators, but most importantly, with additional stakeholders or additional signatories involved in this effort. So we see fact-checkers around the table of this discussion, we see civil society, but we don't really see media. And this is something that I would like to emphasize. I think media should be more invited, but also invite themselves more to this kind of conversation because it's important and it's relevant. And the last point that I would like to mention here, and it's related also to what was mentioned in the previous panel, We see, especially at the level of European Union, evolving and growing policy and also regulation in the area of digital rights and trying to curb or insist on transparency, accountability of the digital platforms. But very often in these very needed and good attempts, we leave to platforms to define and operationalize some of the key concepts, such as, for example, what is media pluralism that they should pay due diligence or due consideration to when doing the risk assessment or applying the risk mitigation measures. So in order to make sure that there are no collateral damages, if I may put it this way, we need a really strong public oversight mechanism, and this is why we need access to data. We need strong institutions, research institutions, but also regulators to be able to conduct this public oversight. This is what's crucial here, I think.
Thank you very much, Eva. I would just add to what you said, just throw in a couple of words, the Digital Services Act, which is interlinked with the Code of Practice on disinformation as well, a huge bit of regulation for the EU and also with the Media Freedom Act coming soon. This is an EU discussion, but I suspect these documents are going to be a matter of interest for a broader group of countries. Again, for very quick 2 points to you, Adrian, and
I'll try to make it quick, but for quickness, I'll take 3 short points. First, to media, despite economic pressures and the constant fight for attention, take fact-checking seriously and prioritize it over clickbait, because the truthfulness and the closeness to the facts is the foundation for the business model in the future as well. And then you said before that it would be desirable for fact-checking to be closer to traditional media. This might be in an ideal world, but it has also dangers, especially in countries where pluralism within a single media system or within a single media outlet is not assured. So, and that would lead into my recommendation for policymakers. Consider financing, funding, and supporting fact-checking organizations in addition to the traditional media system, because depending on your circumstances, they are a really crucial actor to provide the resilience that you need. And then the last very quick one on fact-checkers themselves, because they need to further develop and strengthen their professional standards as well to demonstrate how they practice their profession, how they that they be transparent about their processes, where they get their funding from, and how they can demonstrate their value to society as large.
Are you going to take any questions? Yes, sir, absolutely. But please let our speakers answer the question that they're dealing with at the moment. Please don't interrupt. Melanie, over to you.
Thank you. I'll be quick. Just to a few recommendations will be probably first to set up either local or national funding schemes focused on what I spoke about, local or community media. That was done already in Ireland, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, or I understood here in Latvia as well. Maybe to encourage as well innovative and alternative ways of funding. That's what I spoke about a minute ago. So, for instance, the Solidarity Press companies in France, for which a very specific legal framework was settled, which is an adaptation as well. And the other main thing, as I think, would be to ensure the quality by training and attracting journalists in local media. It can be done with partnership between media or a media association or journalists with local authorities and with local media. That's what BBC did with Local Democracy Reporter Scheme, in which the National Public Broadcaster Funds trains journalists in local media. A French journalist also told me that was what his major newspaper in France was doing out of Europe, but in Africa as well, just mentoring local journalists to be sure to have reliable information. And the last thing maybe would be to increase awareness about their role, the role of journalists among local politicians, maybe with codes of practice, but also among the public. That's very important. That's the first audience. And that's what we do during the Prix Bayeux Calvados Normandy of War Correspondence every year in Bayeux next week, if you want to have a look. But during the week, we have more than 15,000 young people in 12 different countries and 6,000 pupils in Calvados working on media literacy and with journalists. I think it does really start with this kind of thing.
Thank you, Melanie. Now, I do feel that there is an interest in the room to interact with our speakers. I'll take two questions from that side. You, sir, in row 6, and then we go further back.
I think I could answer the question.
Oh, we'll come to that later as well. Perhaps we take 2 or 3 questions together to make it more efficient. So that gentleman over there, yes, you, and then the gentleman behind you, and then you, sir.
Yes, thank you. I heard several times the word media as a partner with fact checkers and with other entities like internet or big platform representatives. So, Eva, I feel you said that you have the image of meeting around the table with representatives of media, fact checkers, and platform actors. One thing is, who is media? Because media means journalists and media owners. I cannot imagine a meeting between Murdoch, Musk, and whoever we want as fact checker, debating upon a topic of resilience towards false news.
Sorry, can I please ask you to ask a question?
It was a question.
Okay, okay, excellent, thank you. And you are, please,
so many questions have been raised here. For the
so,
future
could you
of
please
the press.
tell us who you are?
Paulo Pisco, I'm a member of the Portuguese Parliament and member of the Council of Europe. My question is related to disinformation. And I wanted to ask you if, as the title of a well-known work of the philosopher Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, if disinformation is produced by the enemies of open societies and democracies, and if it is linked, especially to the extreme right parties in our societies that I've been raising. The other question is about the future of the press as the way we know it. Because at the same time that the newspapers, as has been told, are disappearing, the disinformation is more and more present in our societies, causing through all those problems. Which will be the future of the traditional press, the way we know it? Because it seems that everything will disappear. The newspapers have no money. The question of the money is fundamental, and that it poses a problem. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And gentleman behind you.
My name is Stefan Schenner from the Austrian Parliament and member of BASE, and I was before the General Rapporteur for Media Freedom and Safety on Journalists, and now I'm the Rapporteur for SLAPS. In my report about AI, the title was AI and the Labor Market, a friend or foe. I said exactly that for the journalism is it extremely dangerous and unsafe field of work, because more and more contents are regenerated by AI. And when we are speaking about journalists matter, then we should also speak about the guarantee of the jobs for journalists. And if you have a look into the concentration of the money behind news companies which overcross. They have a radio, they have online, they have traditional newspaper, radio. It's all in one hand. And when you take now the combination...
So can I please ask you to phrase a question to the panel?
With AI, then you see what is going on, and the subsidies of the states should be not given to the budget of the media, should given for special project that you have correspondent, that you develop a journalist, investigative journalist, and then.
Okay, thank you. So we have 3 questions here, and I think, Eva, maybe you could start, and the others could take the other questions as well.
Thank you for the question. I will try to clarify what I actually meant here. And so the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation is a kind of voluntary co-regulatory instrument. It's still code of practice, but under the Digital Services Act, it should transform to the code of conduct, which means that it should be strengthened. It should become an instrument to comply with the DSA. So this is why it is so important. It is also important because it has inspired similar codes in other parts of the world. For instance, in Australia, in New Zealand, but also the United Nations have been discussing and are towards the adopting code of conduct for information integrity on digital platforms that is explicitly inspired by the code of practice, EU Code of Practice on Disinformation. So when I said the media should be at this table, I just wondered, I wasn't specifying who exactly, there could be representatives, that could be, but what I was trying to emphasize here is that the voice of the media, but especially the voice of the journalists, should be heard, should be there in these discussions, because what we have at the moment is a code of practice where we have signatories. These signatories are primarily very large online platforms, so the leading platforms, advertisers and advertising industry. We're seeing civil society and fact-checking organizations, but we are not seeing to the same extent the presence of media and journalists. And many measures that are being adopted within the Code of Practice on Disinformation that are also being implemented are affecting visibility and thus also sustainability of the media content and access to citizens to the media content. So the fact that these measures are being adopted and are being implemented and will now be strengthened under the Digital Services Act, for us is not ideal if the media are not part of those negotiations, especially considering the importance of media pluralism and so on.
Thank you, Eva. Now, I think, Andrew, you wanted to answer another question. If you could do so quite briefly, because I want to take one more question from the audience.
Surely. So I'll address the AI issue, friend or foe. I mean, it's moving so fast that I don't think any of us in this room or outside this room can precisely indicate where the barometer needle is in that respect. What I can say is that more news media companies every day are switching off, and you'll have to forgive my sort of shorthand in this respect, but switching off the ability of big tech to extract information from both historic archives and live news. So there is already, I think that is a really good telling point, that the news media companies are saying, no more, we don't understand this, we have big reservations about it, it's not just another tool, it has the potential to be a much more pernicious tool than any other that we've had. So the jury is very much out, but I think, as I said earlier on, the news media industry is very much on it, and very much concerned about the impact on businesses, but also on society as well.
Thank you, Andrew. Yanis, if you take the disinformation question.
Disinformation is there to create an impact. So whoever is seeking it, and these are malign states that wish harm, these are political groups whose value systems within our own countries make it kind of okay to use that as a parameter of gaining more power. Or there are more narrow interest groups within our societies that might not necessarily seek the political power, but are seeking to have an impact on a specific area. And all of those work in a conundrum. And the big piece is that the worst of them is these authoritarian systems because they wish the biggest harm, but then the other two, obviously, actors are also harmful.
Thank you, Yanis. Now, we only have time for one question. I would like the gentleman who raised his voice about the need for Q&A, perhaps. I suspect you also have a question, so if you could give us that.
Yeah, you suspect correctly. There's been a bit of an irony about the whole session. A number of you have mentioned about the importance of involving policymakers. I'm George Fawkes. I'm a member of Parliament from the United Kingdom. And along with Stefan Schenach, Morgan Jensen, David Blencathra here, I'm a member of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee of the Council of Europe. We've produced a number of reports on this issue, on this question. We've made recommendations in relation to pluralism of ownership, public funding of media, and a whole range of things. How many of you have read them? These reports go to the Council of Ministers, and then from the Committee of Ministers, and then from the Committee of Ministers to national parliaments. How many of you have read them, and could you tell me what they say?
Was that your question, sir? Or, well,
exactly. Eva makes a really good point. It's not about how many have read it, but how many have implemented it, and how and who. I think maybe I speak for a lot of people in this room. We're all very much involved in these issues, and I think most of us, if not all of us, have read a large part of all of these recommendations. But you pointed it out yourself, because it's not just the policymakers. The policymakers in the national member states, they are diverse. It's members of parliament as yourself, and I think it's great that we have members of parliament here in this room today. But the fact is, quite often I see in my country that members of parliament are not actively following what the recommendations are in the Council of Europe or in other similar forums. And I think that's the key problem here, because that's where we need to, that's where the policy will be implemented in the end.
When we speak of the actionable points, should we add printing enough copies of these wonderful reports to send them to each member of parliament in the country involved? Sir, thank you very much for raising this, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to accommodate all the questions. There might be, we have to summarize here what I heard very quickly. We need to adapt, or the media need to adapt to the new technological landscape. Media still need funding, media still need protection, they need respect from the policymakers because of what they do, and there is need for trust in media, but also the media have to make sure that they earn that trust by being factual, precise, and serving their audiences. That's a very, perhaps useless way of summarizing it. Nevertheless, we have to summarize this discussion. I would like to thank our panelists for their very interesting contributions. A round of applause would be useful.